This is part of a series we call these talks pop-up exhibitions. We connect presenters who are both from campus and the broad community with objects, documents from the Magnus collection. And on a day like today, with election results very much in everybody's mind, I really want to celebrate what we do, because we are very much engaged with preserving, rethinking, redistributing cultural heritage, and especially cultural heritage that's been lost, that has been dissipated in the crevices of history. So it's really what we do every day, and we are fortunate that we have a space to do so and a forum to do so, and that we can think together and also listen to good music occasionally. So it's with this in mind that I invited my dear friend to speak today. And what is happening in San Francisco Bay Area is something that, to me as a musicologist coming to the Bay Area about 13 years ago, I realized there was a great resource for Jewish music in the Jewish Community Library. And I thought, well, somebody, or maybe various people must have contributed. And finally, I realized that Howard Freedman was the genie behind that model in collecting, preserving, and making available all kinds of resources about Jewish music. And then in meeting Howard, I realized what a passionate student and scholar of Jewish music he is. So it was sort of like a natural fit to invite Howard today to speak. Based on the especially the 78 RPM, this very obscure object of desire when we teach students, we have to go into some lengthy conversations to explain what a 78 RPM is. They say that if you were born before 1986, you don't know what to sound like a broken record means, right? So in this case, we're really diving into the depths of collections of musical memory, and through music, identity, collective identity, and identity of American Jewish history. Thank you, Howard, for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to have you here, and we'll all enjoy your talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Francesco, for inviting me, and it's nice to feel a sense of community on what probably feels like a day of mourning. And I'm glad I signed up to give this talk, because I feel if I didn't have some to do today, I probably would have consumed a fifth of liquor last night. So how many of you, just a brief poll, would you feel that you have familiarity with Jewish music in general? It's about how, okay, so maybe it'll help me in terms of some of the terminology. So, so as Francesco said, one of the great things about this series here at the Magnus is that it casts a spotlight on dimensions of the collection that might not otherwise be apparent. And this is really a case in point. The development of the Magnus collection was highly idiosyncratic. Seymour and Rebecca Frommer were often saving parts of Jewish culture that others were uninterested in. And so it is that boxes of 78 RPM records became part of a museum collection. I see my job here is in part to tell you why those 78s, which some of you may associate with thrift stores more than a museum, belong in a museum that records the Jewish experience. I'll start with just a bit about my own relationship to this material. I'm really not an academic scholar. This is purely a private and personal interest of mine. I've been listening to scratchy old music since I was a teenager, and when I had just entered my 20s, I was visiting my grandmother, and my Uncle Sanford took out my grandfather's, who had long deceased, his 78 RPM records. And the first one he played was Cantor Pinchik's Rose of the Shabbos, which was a heck of a place to start. And I just, it was a life-transforming experience for me. It was both such sublime music with such power that I really had never encountered in Jewish music, and also the fact that I was sort of having this parallel experience with my listening to the pieces of shellac that my grandfather had so many times put on his record player, that it was a unique kind of connection that I experienced. As I became more interested in the 78s, I did learn about the Magnus collection here and visited here in about 1990. I mean, when it was not here, when it was over on Russell. And it really was an important collection, and one of the reasons is its role in the klezmer revival that happened really in the 1970s. In 1975, the leader of what was then the pioneers of the klezmer music revival on the West Coast, the group was the Klezmorim, the leader was Lev Lieberman, discovered the records that were at the Magnus. He had been interested in immersing himself in the music that had been played in the early decades of the century. And in contrast to other kinds of ethnic music, of traditional music, where, say, if you think about Irish or Appalachian or Greek music, there's a real passing on of tradition across generations. We didn't really have that same organic capacity in Yiddish and klezmer music, as a result, I mean, when you think about it, it's a combination of assimilation, the Holocaust, changing tastes, the rise of Israeli music, so many factors that made that connection very difficult. And so the place to look, and plus the records had not been, these songs had not been released on vinyl. The old music had not been discovered and re-released as it has been today. So the place to look was 78s. So he discovered that box in 78s of the Magnus, and the other great place, and probably the more significant place, was actually the home of Dr. Martin Schwartz, who is here right now, and Martin Schwartz is a UC Berkeley professor who happened to have also emerged as one of the world's foremost collectors of Jewish 78s, happened to be in Berkeley, and he offered not only the music itself, but also being knowledgeable about the language, religion, and the music, was able to provide a context that actually really informed the Klezmorim. The Klezmorim released the first record of the klezmer revival. It was released in early 1977 on Argulia, local label. So it's important, and the Magnus collection is still accessible and still has a significant impact, and it's just fantastic. So let's talk about the records. So I'm really not pursuing a central thesis here. I really just want to share some of the sounds. I'm going to play a lot of very short clips just for lack of time. And I have a sign-up sheet in the back, and what I'll do, if you sign up for it, I'll send, you're not going to get on a mailing list, but I will send you a list of what I'm playing, and often there are links online. You could hear the full songs. I'm not going to play any full songs, you know. So really what I want to emphasize is what the records show about the interplay of Jewish music and American popular culture in the early decades of this century, the past century. It's good to remember the population that we're talking about. In 1880, there were approximately 250,000 Jews in the United States, and most of them came from a German background, and there were still also families from the early Sephardic immigrants to the United States that were influential. But the picture really changes in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Between 1880 and 1924, when strict restrictions on immigration were imposed, there are about close to 2.5 million Jews who entered the United States. About half of those Jews settled in New York City, and about half of the Jews in New York City settled in the Lower East Side. So I mention this to clarify that the vast majority of American Jews in the first half of the 20th century, who were the chief audiences for the records I'm going to be playing, were immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. Most didn't have much money, and a large percentage spoke Yiddish as their first language. It's actually remarkable to me how the rise of the phonograph corresponds in chronology to the increased Jewish presence in the United States. So Thomas Edison pioneered the reproduction of sound with his introduction of the phonograph cylinder in 1877. Emil Berliner, who was a German-born Jew, then invented the disc record in 1888. And this really represented a huge change in technology. Prior to this, music was experienced through live performance, and the big money in the music business was in selling sheet music to play the songs. So most of the first Jewish records actually were not by Jews at all. They were in the tradition of minstrel shows. Paralleling the caricatures of blacks, the so-called Hebrew comedian was a staple of vaudeville. It incorporated stereotypes that ranged simply from heavy accents to anti-Semitic images of cheap, dirty money grubbers. The music often had no ethnic component, but did use Jewish musical and linguistic tags. So I'm going to play an example, and in this song, which is called When Mose with His Nose Leads the Band, this was recorded in 1906 by Collins and Harlan, and it was written by 3 Irish Americans. You'll hear actually a musical quote from, many of you will know, Chosin Kale Mazel Tov, which is actually originally from a Jewish opera, but is sung at Simchas. And so let's go ahead and listen to what this example sounds like. Oops. Oh, actually, let me go, sorry. So what we get is we get the imitations of the accents, we get and we get the names, the stereotypes, and we get this musical quote. So for the most part, this really was a Gentile business, but Jews quickly got into it. And one of the biggest practitioners was Irving Berlin, who was himself an immigrant and spoke with the sort of accent that these songs mocked. His early songs included Cohen Owes Me $97 and Yiddle With Your Fiddle, Play Some Ragtime. Incidentally, so I'm going to play this song, just the opening again, and what I want you to listen to is see if, well, actually just for lack of time, many people believe that Irving Berlin stole the melody for God Bless America from the beginning of the song. Same notes. So his biggest song stolen from an anti-Semitic parody. So let's talk about how actual Jewish music came to be recorded. It's insufficiently recognized that record companies were really phonograph companies. In 1912, there were only 3 manufacturers of phonographs in the country: Victor, Edison, and Columbia, and the formats were incompatible with each other. Edison and Victor were sort of like Betamax and VHS, although as Francesco indicated, those metaphors may be lost on the under 50 set. But 4 years later, when the patent rules were loosened, there were dozens of companies. And if these companies were going to sell phonographs, which were costly, they had to make sure that their potential buyers were motivated. And the discs themselves were actually quite expensive. So record companies learned that immigrants wanted to hear music from their native countries. So if they wanted to sell phonographs to the immigrants, they had to provide the records that they would want to hear. They created ethnic catalogs, sometimes called foreign lists, in which they recorded Italian, Greek, Russian, Irish, really a huge number of nationalities, and then they marketed those discs to the groups. These were explicit. In Columbia, there was an E series that stood for ethnic. Victor used number series for its releases to denote which nationality the recordings were for. And these efforts included the release of several thousand Jewish records. Many people would expect this to be dominated by what we today term klezmer music, but in fact that's far from the case. The big sellers were often cantorial or theatrical songs, vocal songs, comedy monologues, and less so the instrumental music. So I'm going to talk about each one of these very briefly. So cantors were sort of the rock stars of the Jewish world. The most famous had their own style that people could recognize immediately. Some of the cantors performed only liturgical music, and some crossed over to, some did Yiddish songs, some did opera. And the most famous was Yossele Rosenblatt, and you can see him actually in the film The Jazz Singer in a very stiff performance. That was after he ended up doing vaudeville, after he lost his shirt in a sort of scam. And actually I should mention another popular crossover cantor was Moshe Oisher, and at the Jewish Community Library tomorrow evening we're having a program by the cantor at Congregation Emmanuel, Arik Luck, about Moishe. It should be fascinating. So some religious families would only permit cantorial records in their home. They were opposed to secular music. And families, secular families often bought cantorial music because of its emotional depth and the way it summoned the old world. I'm going to play a couple of examples, again, just short clips. So this first one is Shema Yisrael by Leib Glantz. Leib Glantz was one of the great chazanim. So that the accompaniment was frequently for organ, and of course one would not have heard that on a holiday in an Orthodox synagogue. That was purely. What was that? I actually don't have the year for that, but that would have likely been in the 20s. The next one I'm going to play is actually another thing you wouldn't find in an Orthodox synagogue, and see if you can figure out what I'm talking about. Any ideas? What's that? Well, yes, that's a Kiddush for wine. It's a woman. So it's Sophie Kurtzer. She was, women were not allowed in an Orthodox synagogue to do that sort of music, but there was actually a small vaudeville sort of market for a number of women cantors. They were called chazantes, which actually means the wife of a cantor, but there wasn't much vocabulary to use for it. But and that was from 1925 on Pape. So these are all Ashkenazi, and I'm really doing because I mentioned the kind of population, the Jewish population, but there was a significant amount of Sephardic cantorial music. I'll just play a very quick sample of one. And so this is Isaac Al-Ghazi, who was born in Turkey, moved to Montevideo, and was one of the most popular of the Sephardic cantors. You can hear the accompaniment is oud rather than organ. So we're going to move from cantorial music to the songs of the theater, just another sort of popular song. So it's widely known that Jews contributed disproportionately to American songwriting. Many of the... Is that a... oh, that's a phone, okay. No, that's why I thought I was malfunctioning. Okay, so Jewish composers were responsible for a huge portion of the American songbook, although for the most part there's little that's explicitly Jewish in most of those works. Additionally, many of the best-selling recording artists of the day were Jewish. Although most of them changed their names, most did not walk away from their identities. For example, Al Jolson, who was the son of a cantor, starred in The Jazz Singer as the son of a cantor, and sang Kol Nidre, and at the height of his popularity, he also released a Yiddish recording, version of a Chazan Dalav Shabbos. Sophie Tucker released My Yiddish Mama, both on English on one side of the 78 and in Yiddish on the other side. But these Jewish entertainers were all in the popular series, not in the ethnic catalog. So what we'd find in the ethnic catalog would be songs from the Yiddish theater, folk songs, comic songs, ballads, lots of different things. And so I'd like to share a few sort of categories with you. The first is what we would call first would be incorporating American popular song into Yiddish. So I'm going to play this by Pesach Kaperstein, and you figure out what song this is. So when we say, so it's Yeser is mein Kale. So does anybody know what a Kale is? A bride. So we already have. It's interesting to try to translate these ideas from English to Yiddish. You know, my baby means something different from my bride. You're saying it's kosher and it's okay. We can do this. You know, we're married. So and then Frag kein Scheile. Instead of don't mean maybe, a shaila is a religious question that one would pose to a rabbi, like, you know, can I eat green beans on Passover? So it's this is definitely specific to the Jewish experience. So another kind of song would be the topical song. So this is sort of a lost phenomenon. It was particularly for populations that were illiterate or didn't have access to news. Topical songs often helped convey news and events of the day. So there were dozens of songs that marked the Titanic disaster in many languages. In blues, the Great Mississippi River Flood of 1927 inspired dozens of songs. So we have many of those in Yiddish as well, and here's a sort of popular example. So Charles Levine was a Jew who financed a transatlantic flight just 2 weeks after Lindbergh's famed voyage in 1927. He didn't just finance it, he actually was the passenger and the navigator in the two-man plane that Clarence Chamberlain flew across the Atlantic, actually beating Lindbergh's speed and distance record just a few weeks after Lindbergh's flight. So Levine was a great hero to Jews, the first Jew to cross the Atlantic, but he was snubbed by President Coolidge, and several songs, primarily in Yiddish, made sure that this achievement was recognized. So here's one that contains both Yiddish and English that are in the same song, called Levine mit seinem Flying Machine. Okay. preserve this event, which is largely a forgotten event, into the present day. So, so I'm sort of, for lack of time, I'm not going to do much of the vocal music. Again, if you sign up, I'll send you some examples of the popular vocal music of the day. And I'm going to move to instrumental music. So one of the things that we really get from the old records, from the 78s, is the diversity of Jewish music. What subsequently happened over the decades in America is that Jewish music often became dance music for bar mitzvah and wedding receptions, and a lot of the forms and a lot of the subtleties, a lot of the technique became lost to us until the klezmer revival. So I'm going to play as a representative just a snippet of Joseph Moskowitz's Doina, both because it shows a form that fell into disfavor. The Doina is I think it's a Romanian form with probably Middle Eastern sources that became part of the Jewish. It was a common certainly in the 19th century and early 20th century repertoire, and also the instrumentation. This is the cymbal. This is the hammered dulcimer that was one of the most significant Jewish instruments, but which similarly faded away in the early 20th century. So this is from 1916, literally a century ago. So similarly, I can send you I'll send you more musical examples from this time, especially that show the development, also what happened to the music over the course of the decades in the United States, where it started to be much more influenced by jazz in a number of ways. I'm going to move on to some different material. So after 1930, the companies radically reduced their ethnic catalog. So this was really in response to the restrictions that were imposed by immigration in the 20s. There were no more immigrants coming in to consume this music, and those who were already in the United States were assimilating rapidly to American culture and were not nearly as interested in pursuing the Jewish music as their focus. For the most part, the 78, certainly the major labels, 78s, start to decline radically in the late 1920s and the 30s. But there was an interesting phenomenon I just want to mention, which was in the late 1930s, that Yiddish music momentarily sort of crossed the line from the ethnic catalogs to the pop catalogs in popular culture. So I'm going to play you two really quick clips. The first is from let's see, play it from. So this is probably the most famous, the Belf Romanian orchestra, which was recorded in Europe. This is a small clip of Nocha Bissell, and just listen to the melody. So we have that melody, and then this is probably the most popular melody, probably overused melody in all of Jewish music at the time. It's known as, this is actually a record that's here, one of the records. It's Tanz Tanz Yiddelech by Abe Schwartz's orchestra, but it's also known as Reb Dovidel and Mayofus. And so this is the other melody. play these both because you're going to find both of these. Actually, I went ahead of myself before we talked about the 30s. So in 1920, we have a recording by the original Dixieland Jazz Band. So the original Dixieland Jazz Band is famous as having created the first jazz record in history, the Library Stable Blues, and it was wildly successful. They were from New Orleans, mostly from Italian descent, none of them Jewish, but there was this fascination with the Oriental sound, and they incorporated both of those melodies I just played into their song Palestina. This is from 1920, original Dixieland Jazz Band. That's from Nocha Bissell, the first one I played. You can hear it applying the New Orleans style with the trombone sort of a column response. And here's the second melody. Then that same year, Eddie Cantor saw the remarkable success of Palestina, and he wrote words for it. So just a few months later, we get this song.
They say that Lena is the queen of Palestina, just because they like her concertina. She plays with day and night, she plays with all her might. She never gets it right, but how they love it, one or other. I murder, they don't survive. Oh, murder, still it was night. She was fat, but she got leaner. She got her concertina down old Palestina.
Instead of my Yopis, this is what happens. So we have, again, Hassan Khaled, Mazel Tov, that we heard in the very first clip, this idea of using these signifying Jewish musical tags. So this becomes, that's a rather unique instance, but what happens in the late 1930s is that we have a huge phenomenon that's quite similar. So many of you are familiar with the song By Mir Bist Du Shem. That sort of, so By Mir Bist Du Shem there's a sort of long story behind it, that it was a Yiddish theatrical song that was then played it was heard in the Catskills by two black performers who then sang it at the Apollo. It was heard by Sammy Kahn at the Apollo, and he went and bought the rights to the song, first offered it to Tommy Dorsey. Tommy Dorsey declined, said it's in Yiddish, why do I want that? And then he wrote English lyrics, and it was sung by the Andrews Sisters, and it became the most popular song ever released in the history of music up to that point, and that was 1938. In response to the success, suddenly there was a rash of popular music that incorporated Jewish themes. So the biggest example was, so this is the Stiller Bulgar. You can hear this melody. This is from 1917. Ziggy Elman, who was the trumpeter for the Benny Goodman Orchestra, translated it into a song called Freilich and Swing, and actually turned it into a swing number. And then that was successful, and Benny Goodman said, well, let's go one step further, and actually Johnny Mercer developed words for it. And you can see it became And the Angels Sing, and it became a much mellower song, but there's an interesting contrast in this. We're going to have the mellow translation of that melody, and then it goes nuts into a Bulgar. Bulgar is the sort of, particularly signifying dance that has sort of the beat is like sort of 1, 4, and 7 if I'm in an 8-beat measure or series of beats. So, so quickly, I know we're almost out of time here. So this was a really sort of unique moment in this, in getting Jewish music from one of the most popular band leaders. And again, it was there was a true following of, there were lots of songs. They were drawing from the Yiddish catalog. Yosel Yosel became Joseph Joseph. The Green Cuisina was released as my Green Cousin by Benny Goodman. There was The Night of Cher by the Berry Sisters and Seymour Rexite, became a Carmen Miranda song, The Wedding Samba. There became this huge phenomenon where we could probably do about 20 Yiddish songs that actually end up making it as jazz songs. And something, maybe just in closing for lack of time, I've mentioned that sort of crossover of the klezmer in Yiddish music. There was also a crossover of the cantorial sound. And so sometimes it is ridiculous. This is Judy Garland's introduction to her cover of By Mir Bist Du Schön, which is, well, yes, there's a ridiculousness to it, but here you go, you'll hear it. Misapplication of it's changed the genre. So, but actually, so Cole Porter, famously actually wrote in a much more Jewish mode than any of the. Even he was the sort of single non-Jewish composer in that great, along with the Jews of Gershwin, Irving Berlin, etc. But he frequently wrote Jewish melody into his songs. My Heart Belongs to Daddy is a case, and Valley the Snow, in her 1939 recording, really milks that. So you can hear this here.
Yes, my heart belongs to Daddy, so I simply couldn't be bad. Yes, my heart belongs to Daddy.
And then you have Cab Calloway, who incorporated a lot of Jewish ideas, and here is his Taylor song. So this is an anglicization of an old Yiddish folk tale, folk song. It was a Taylor song. we're going to have to close, so I have a lot more music, and I'd be happy to send you links or talk about any of it. Basically, this brings us towards the end of the 78 era. The end of the 78s comes in, it's 1948 that the 33 RPM record takes hold. It's also invented by a Jew. And the thing I was going to talk about when I have time is two important post-war groups, the Barton Brothers and the Mickey Katz, who started out on 78s and had a very significant impact in American Jewish culture in sort of a time of transition. But I will stop here, and we have maybe a couple of minutes for questions. Thank you.
Yeah. The Barton Brothers.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more.
Okay, really quick, just because so the Barton Brothers were the creators of Joe and Paul. So Joe and Paul was the most popular Yiddish record of its day. It sold more than 1 million copies. And what happened was actually they adopted a red buttons routine, and then when he was in the war, in World War II, they sort of stole it from him and made it into a record. And it comes out as a satire of what was an existing commercial for an actual clothing store, and they turned it into a very earthy body song in which they talk about instead of sending your kid to this clothing store just to get him fitted, it's sending basically about going to a prostitute, going to all stuff that's really it's an so it was essentially in the genre of party songs, but it was a huge seller. And then that was what was an inspiration for Mickey Katz largely when he saw what a huge seller the Barton Brothers were, and they were very much used that sort of English. They're in that border where if you don't know English, if you don't know Yiddish, you can't understand it. If you only spoke Yiddish, you can't understand it. It's yeah, I can play a little about it. But I'd probably take more questions if possible. Yes.
Were the Barton Brothers African American?
No.
No. Okay, I'm thinking maybe of a different. And that draws me to the point. Another question that I originally had. You said that the early jazz, the Dixieland jazz, but then it was adopted, most of that, by white jazz artists like the Benny Goodmans and the trumpeters and his band. Did any, or Tommy Dorsey, whatever, did any African-American musicians from that jazz era actually adopt some of the Yiddish music?
There were a couple of instances where black bands played Jewish songs. For instance, there's the Washboard Serenaders did a Yiddish version of what's originally a Russian song, Moche Cherny. There are a number of examples. There's a lot of examples of sort of affinity where there's like Slim and Slam doing songs that are sort of indicating their relationship to Jews, but there's not a lot of repertoire that's reflected in among the black bands. But maybe other people would have other examples. Martin, did you?
No, but may I ask a question? First, a few comments. Wonderful lecture. Very interesting. On the Chusn Kala Mazel, that also occurs on Palestina, as does the Kolomeka play under Palestina.
Right.
Both of those tunes, Chusn Kala Mazel Tov and Kolomeka, you find in a wonderful record. I think people should look it up if they don't know it, by the Ted Lewis Ensemble, sometime after Palestina, Egyptian Ella.
Right.
Wonderful musicians on there, Jews and African-American famous musicians. The Palestina was written by, I think, two Jews, Conrad and S. Russell Robinson.
Right.
So they had a number, each of them had a number of songs independently that based on Yiddish tunes. Speaking of Chusn Kala Mazel Tov, you said that it was originally from an opera?
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah, by Michalesko, I think it's that's what
So it was taken up as a wedding?
Yeah, just like Roger Gis McMandelin became a folk song, it was originally from an operetta. They both
Explain why you don't have that particular tune in the earliest klezmer repertoire, the bells and some of the early stuff. And it does appear in the 20s as a klezmer tune, but it's not, for example, where one would expect it. I'm not going to say more about that. There's a companion melody to it, which was recorded in 1908, actually, first in Constantinople by a Jewish man. But the Chusel Kalamazel Tov, which is usually paired with that, does not yet appear there. So thank you for this piece of information. Very interesting.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm going to move slightly off your subject and ask about player piano roles, which
Right.
also evolved during this period. I'm wondering, are there any local archives of Jewish-oriented player piano music, and or are there online resources where you can listen to that?
You know, the answer is I don't know. That was clearly, I didn't mention it, those really emerged in the late 19th century, player piano rolls, and it became a very important, vehicle for prior to the phonograph. I don't know enough about resources for it.
I can help you.
Yeah.
There's a CD out called Klezmerola, which is piano roll, Jewish piano roll music by a guy named Bob Berkman. I can talk to you later.
Yeah.
Great.
I have one. Jewish music.
Ed?
You mentioned signifying these twice in your talk. And for the first time, well, not that I never noticed before, but I didn't notice the significance of the difference between the Stillenberg Army coming and the Angel Sing. The way H. Schwartz orchestra plays that melody and the tempo of Benny Goodman and Ziggy Owens. Maybe I'm cynical, but it's almost like they felt like they had to hop it up to make it sound Jewish. H. Schwartz is like twice as fast, very mellow.
Yeah. I think, it's interesting I think there's, what happens also with the Ziggy Ellman's music, does the same to the idea of like, it's pronouncing, now we're going Jewish, right? It's with that, it's always this very sort of, really hopping melody. And it was probably appealed to somebody when you think about this is the, what do you call it, jitterbug era. And there was probably trying to find an affinity with that, the Jewish beat and the sort of the heavier jazz beats that were in vogue. Yeah.
Yeah, there's also a recording, I'm not sure the name of it, but it's Artie Shaw. It's in the 40s, it's from that album, the Gramercy 5 sessions, where he does a really similar thing to the Angel Sings. Doing this jazz, and then he just launches into the speed, tempo speeds up, and it's some famous klezmer riff that he's doing. Just for about 15 seconds, and then he goes back into jazz.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. It's almost because it's and Artie Shaw was definitely from that background.
It's like clarinet anyway.
Yeah, it's a unique moment because that disappears, but for some reason that became this moment we had both worlds sort of colliding.
They sneak it in.
Yeah, but loudly. It's really people knew that this was Jewish. Yes, Martin.
Well, while you're right in saying it was speeded up to give a more Jewish sort of symbolism, so to speak, the original of that tune is Romanian. I have a disc of the 20s. I don't think it was influenced by the Jewish thing. It's native Romanian piece, and it is played up tempo. Sorry about that, but it's played up tempo. So it started up tempo, then was slowed down, and then up tempo again.
Yeah. So I would guess that the jazz musicians wouldn't have been familiar with the original, the ethnic report. That they were doing it for their own purposes. That's my guess. Yes.
I don't know if this is a fair question, but there's been such a resurgence of Jewish music, interest in both in Yiddish and Jewish. Do you have an opinion on why?
So she asked why, with all the resurgence of so much of interest in Jewish music, what might be the reason? Well, a lot of it is probably a response to other sort of identity. There's a famous story about Henry Sapoznik who was playing old-time Appalachian music, and he was sort of studying at the foot of Tommy Jarrell, who was one of the great both fiddle and banjo players in North Carolina. And Tommy Jarrell noticed that there were all these Jews, this was in the early 1970s, learning this music, and he said, don't you guys have any music of your own? And it was a very legitimate question. And there had been a real disconnect. This was a tradition where there was a true break. And so for people who were interested in traditional music, for Jews who were interested in traditional music, the idea of going into their own backyard, into their own history, it was novel. And a number of them did it. A disproportionate number of those early klezmer revival folk came from the folk music movement, for lack of other word. And they really brought it back. It was dependent on a very small number of people who did a lot of work. The great gift was in New York that Andy Statman was able to study with Dave Terrace, who was one of the great musicians of the 20s and 30s and 40s. And there were really a handful of great musicians who were left from there. And when Henry Sposnick started Klez Camp, and that brought a lot of those living musicians in contact with younger musicians who were eager to learn their styles. And so that was a crucial point of intergenerational intersection. But hopefully this is something that's become more cemented, and that connection is to some degree been restored.
Thank you.